Notice the green bar, the lifestyle group, is much lower than the metformin group, much lower than the placebo. We also looked last week at the compliance. This is important to measure. If people are not taking their assigned pills, placebo, and more importantly, metformin, if no one's taking metformin, it's going to be very difficult to show an effect of metformin. So it's important that you can convince the readers that the people who are assigned to these two different pill groups, placebo and metformin, actually took their assigned treatments. And notice that the compliance was lower in the metformin group. That's a problem. That might be due to side effects. If taking metformin causes discomfort and discomfort causes you to stop taking that pill, that means roughly 1/4 of the people in the metformin group never got the benefit of taking metformin. That might be the reason that that group didn't do as well as you would expect if everyone took metformin. These were questions I asked you to think about, and for the sake of time, I think I'll just skip over those for the time being. And let's see, we have, according to my clock, a little bit more than 10 minutes left. And you might say, gee, Fran, you know, you're a day behind already, and that's usually par for the course for me. But much of these comparisons of choosing your best study design are things we've already talked about. So I will repeat these next week, but most of this is stuff we've heard already, so I'll be able to go through this fairly quickly next week. What I want to do is let's introduce this study design by talking about the homework assignment. Remember, I gave you this background information about maybe people living on the big island of Hawaii or on an island other than Oahu might not have access to the good quality of care that people living on Oahu. And I asked you to think of using an existing database, insurance database, to see if you could answer the question whether people living on one island had better quality of care than another. And I gave you as measures of quality of care these annual exams that diabetics should undergo. Also, you had information on emergency room visits and hospital admissions. And I asked you to think about designing a fairly quick study to address the question, do people, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, in general, people living on other islands have less access to care? Well, here's, in my mind, what I was asking you to think about. You had essentially, from the insurance database, the ability to trace a person over time using his claims or her claims data. At some point in time, a person is diagnosed with diabetes. There'll be a claims for that in your insurance database. You can then follow that person in the future. This is a retrospective cohort study. So for example, you could look at, this might be September of 07, this might be September of 08. This line was just, should be closed a little bit. You can look at the last year of claims data. You could measure whether those people who were previously diagnosed with diabetes were receiving the recommended treatment tests that was mentioned in this assignment. You're also able to look at other measures of poor care. For example, hospital admissions, or more importantly, emergency room visits that might be related to the disease of diabetes might be a marker of poor quality of care. So what you could do was look at emergency room visits or look at, say, hospital readmissions or hospital admissions that were associated with effects of diabetes to see if one group, people from one island, are getting worse care than another. Well, this is the first question that no one really addressed, but I think you'd have to address if you want to do this study, is what are these outcomes? You're going to have information about whether individuals had any of these 4 tests. So how do you summarize that? Do you come up with a fraction? If a person had all 4 recommended tests, 4 out of 4 means he gets 100% of his recommendation. If he only had 1 of those 4, he has 25%. If he had 3 of those 4, he has 75%. Could you treat that as a continuous outcome? Some people have 0, some people have 25, some people have 50, some people have 75, some people have 100% of all 4 tests during that 1-year window of observation. Or do you treat it as having all of them or not having all of them? Categorize it as 100% versus less than 100%. Or do you categorize as having some? at least one versus none. There are many ways to think about how you're going to measure this outcome, going back to the first exercise we had. In terms of indicators of poor care, we could look at hospital readmissions. If you're readmitted to a hospital in a short period of time for the same problem you were first admitted to the hospital, that might be a marker of poor quality of care that brought you back to the hospital with the same problem. Or if you're going to an emergency room, that might be a marker of poor quality of care. Only if the reason for the emergency room visit, though, might be linked to diabetes. If you're going to a hospital emergency room because you're in a hospital, you're in a car accident, it's hard to blame that as poor quality of care associated to your diabetes. So those are things to consider if you're designing these studies. Here's a map of the islands of Hawaii. I did a little search to figure out where the population densities are. They're mostly, as I see, in 4 of these islands. So this is what your study might look like in that retrospective cohort study. Here are your 4 islands. I'm mainly interested maybe in comparing Oahu to the Big Island, though. Some of those diabetics receive good quality of care and some of them don't. And you might want to compare, say, the risk of good quality of care in Oahu versus the risk of good quality of care in the Big Island. That's what you're going to get from that retrospective data. That survey piece I asked you to think about. Let's suppose you wanted to collect more information on these people, because I said you had a small budget to collect added information. I think the first question is, what would you collect? One person said they collect information on socioeconomic status. That's probably not part of this claims data set. There's probably nothing in that claims data set that tells me whether you make a ton of money each year or whether you are very poor. Probably doesn't tell me anything about your educational status. Hospital. So distance from the clinic might be something I want to ask. It might not have anything about your racial ethnic group. From your last name, I might be able to make a guess, but women change their last name when they get married. And with generations, you might have a last name that might not immediately connect to a particular racial ethnic group. So only by surveying people and asking them about their racial ethnic group might you get that information. So you might want to collect new information in terms of confounders you want to control for, things we'll talk about next week. You might want to collect information about effect modifiers, do subgroup analyses to see if Native Hawaiians living on one island have different outcome than Native Hawaiians living on another island. So you do a